Anyone with a question to kick things off? If not, I'll take a prerogative and ask a question. So, it's striking in hearing this conversation about how sort of both of you were well-resourced to, even though it wasn't immediate, but very rapidly access downstream services for these outcomes. And if we're talking about health care disparities, the access to those downstream services, just as the access to the testing initially, is potentially problematic. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about if maybe we're moving into a time period where support for the clinicians around all of the results that they may get back from this type of testing handed to them in a report is less valuable than targeted guidance for high-impact variants that are found and what the next steps are, and more targeted education in that realm, rather than sort of broadly, what is a genetic test and how to understand a risk score.
Hi. I think when you say targeted testing, targeted education, I think it depends on what form that takes. It really depends. I knew a lot about genetic testing before I did my test. And the tutorial that 23andMe walks you through is extensive and comprehensive. I felt like I knew I was educated, but it's not the same thing as dealing with the emotional impact of diagnosis, it's my opinion.
Hi, thank you for sharing your story. Alyssa Levin from Helix. I would love to hear from Sarah and Dorothy a little bit more about how you shared this information with your family members. I am a genetic counselor and I work with screening large populations for things like BRCA. And we know that it is a huge challenge to communicate or get at-risk relatives into the testing process. And so would just love to hear your thoughts on that.
So for me, I shared in my story that I'm an overthinker and very anxious, so I called my mom right away and told her the news. But telling my sister, who would have a great impact, and she had a 50-50 chance of also having the gene, was another story and very difficult to not only inform her of my own health risks, but also that it could impact her myself. So I don't think there was a lot of information that I had received via 23andMe to help direct that. More so my genetic counselor, but once I got that information, there was that gap between my confirmatory testing and my 23andMe results. So I kind of had to navigate that myself, and luckily my mom helped too. But that was a difficult process, and knowing like the right things to say. When it was confirmed that the gene came from my father's side, he also had to share that with his brother. And I know that it was really helpful to have more information to give them written down that they can take with them as well.
My telling my family sort of falls into two groups. My parents, my brother, and those people, and then my children. So I'll leave telling my children out of it because I could talk about all of this for like an hour and I don't want to take too much time. I obviously told both my parents right away and my brother. My brother has an adopted son. So, unlike with Sarah's situation, I didn't have a sister. I don't have sort of downstream female relatives that are right in my immediate family. So I told everybody, but there wasn't sort of a sense of alarm. I did also tell my cousins who have daughters. Nobody in my family has opted to get tested.
Thank you.
Sam Shaker, consultant and member of the Roundtable. Sarah and Dorothy, thank you again for sharing your powerful stories with us. We really appreciate it. This question is for Cinnamon. In looking through your slides, I think I recall where you said that most people studied had not changed their behavior despite receiving that or in the face of receiving the genetic testing. I'm wondering if there are studies that discern the difference between those who get the testing and get counseling for those who get the testing and don't see counseling, whether that changes the behavior. And if there aren't studies that show that, is that a logical next path to pursue in terms of truly understanding implementation?
Thanks for the question. Great question. So there have been a handful of studies, mostly limited to those 3 cohorts that I mentioned, trying to look at, what are the other factors that might kind of interact with getting the information and then therefore promote, hopefully positive behavior change. And so I know when we were doing our work with the Scripps Genomic Health Initiative, I believe PGen has come out with some studies on this as well. From my read of the literature, it actually doesn't necessarily, or consistently across studies, sharing doesn't necessarily prompt significant changes. So I think, kind of continuing to think through, what are other factors that we might be able to put in place that would, kind of capitalize on this opportunity is important.
Kathy Wickland, and actually I have a comment, Cinnamon, and then another question I originally came up for. Do you also think like some of the past studies were based on some of the GWAS? As far as like actual health behavior change, a lot of it was GWAS studies that were done and people maybe were not, changing behavior based on that. What's interesting now is that people are getting BRCA 1 or 2
Yes.
results back by this way, which was not happening 10 years ago. So I agree, like when you were talking about more studies being needed, like the impact is really different. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Absolutely. And I think, it's interesting too. Yes, the types of results going back have changed. They've kind of changed over the course of the last 10 years, absolutely. And I think it's interesting. There was one study, though, from, many years ago, I think it was maybe 2012 or 2013, that actually was done by 23andMe in conjunction with some faculty at Stanford, where they invited everyone in their database who had had a positive result for BRCA to engage in the study. And, one thing, we could sort of talk about the results of that, but I think one point I would make about that study, and I think another perhaps limitation of all of the studies that I mentioned, is that you're sort of studying people who choose to participate in research, right? And people who choose to get tested. And so I think, there's a selection bias there that's important to consider as well.
Right. Thank you. And
I just wanted to make a point to define GWAS. Not a lot of people know what that means. It's genome-wide association study, and that's where they associate certain genetic variants with a risk for a particular disease.
Thanks, Tina. Okay, now I still have another question. So, Sarah, Dorothy, thank you so much for sharing your story. Speaking on behalf of the Planning Committee, we were absolutely thrilled that you all accepted our invitation to come and talk to us. And I hope my students that are Northwestern, maybe listening to this, will hear what you said about the psychosocial implications and impact of getting this information. But also what I want to ask you is, and I think both of you kind of made a comment that where you opened up your result and you skimmed through and this probably preparatory information, or I don't know, and I know that companies try to, of course, think about giving this information and the impact it can have on people. And I think they try to give some sort of window into this, or you read all of this before you get results. But you both really talked about just like, I'm just getting through this. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
I don't think I read anything on that actual page. I was so anxious at the time. I just wanted to see my results. So truthfully, I don't think I read one thing. I just clicked to get through to the results. I don't know if everyone is as anxious as me, but I imagine that could be a likelihood that could happen.
Yeah, it's funny because we were talking about this on the phone before, which is I also clicked through it without really reading it, but because I just assumed it was going to say that I was healthy. So it was sort of the same thing for a different, I feel like you said that you just sort of assumed it was going to say that you were, and I just thought that it would say, oh yeah, you don't have this. So I also just sort of clicked through it.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mona Miller. I'm with the American Society of Human Genetics. Thank you both for sharing your stories. I'm curious, in addition to the experience that you had as a recipient of health information, I'm curious whether the role of research was in your mind either before or after some of the experiences you had when you first decided to spit in the tube. Was there a sense of a larger opportunity to participate in research, to better understand genetics fundamentals and structure and function? And then having gone through what you've gone through, how you think about the data that is being accumulated to help people like you who have experienced this for myriad other conditions. So you experienced this as a health goal, but obviously this generates data that can be used by others. And I'm curious about your thoughts as both a patient and potentially somebody contributing to research.
So when I did the test, I was very concerned about the safety of my data, like really, really, really concerned about the safety of my data. So when you do the test, it gives you lots of options for essentially all these privacy options, and I essentially chose all of them. I was like, don't show this to anybody, as private as possible, lock it in the vault, throw it away, whatever. After I got my results, I went back and I changed all those options for exactly the reason you're talking about, because I felt like I want to do everything I can to help other people. And if doctors are going to be able to take my DNA and use it for research, then I want to make that as available to them as possible. The other thing I did was I joined, and you guys are all going to know the name of this test, and I'm completely going to forget it. It's called All of Us, or... right? Yeah. So when I went to the hospital and they asked if I wanted to do that, I was like, sign me up, I'll do anything. It completely changed my output and made me feel like I want to do everything I can to help with the research, especially because, and this is a topic that I know is important here today, with BRCA specifically, it only does test these variants that are in Ashkenazi Jews, and yet people who are African American, people who are Hispanic, this mutation is in every it's in all different cohorts. And the reason why I think it's only found in one population is because those are the people who are studied. Now, obviously, I can't help, because I'm not minority, that's not helping, but that's sort of the small thing that I can do. And I think that idea of that broader research is incredibly important.
Before doing the test, I didn't think much about research. I was more first doing it just as a holiday gift, kind of mindlessly doing it, and excited to see how Jewish I was. And then I, last minute, just added on the health benefits because I saw it was so easy you could do it and it would just show up right away. So there wasn't much thought put into it. But I did check all the privacy opposite, but I didn't care because I thought it would be good for them to use my DNA for research or other purposes later down. I didn't put much thought into that either. Now, obviously, I kept the same answers because I do think it's important that they can utilize my DNA to help impact future consumers and future decisions.
Thank you.
I had a combination question and comment. So for Sarah, you mentioned that your cousin died of breast cancer, and she knew she carried a BRCA2 mutation. How did you find that out?
So it was my dad's cousin, and she gave the paperwork of all the information about her gene to my parents. But at the time, I guess we didn't think much about what that really meant if she had it. And I think you think, breast cancer, you think about the women on your mom's side. And I didn't really put two and two together, I think, about how it could impact my family as much.
And Dorothy, it was your aunt, did you say?
Yeah, it was my father's sister, my aunt.
And was she genetically tested, do you know?
No, she died when she was in her early 40s. I never met her, and she wasn't tested, and her children have chosen not to get tested.
I just want to make a couple comments. One is this really peculiar fantasy that because men don't have breasts and ovaries, that they can't transmit the mutation. And you hear this over and over again, and of course it's a totally incorrect and improper conclusion. The second comment I wanted to make is about the issue of family outreach, and that's something that genetic counselors are very good at. And it's one of the reasons, I think, to get genetic counselors involved. But also, I think, once again, I think it's an indictment of the medical care system that we are brought up in genetics to think that everything has to be non-directive. So whatever either you do it or you don't do it, it's up to you and all that. Well, I mean, when I had someone in my office, and I say, oh, you can smoke cigarettes. It's okay. It's up to you, one way or the other. I'm not going to be directive about it. And I think it's time for us to move away from that model and to be a little more directive. My company, for example, offers no charge testing to all the relatives of somebody who tests positive for a significant mutation. I can tell you that it has increased the uptake, but not enormously. I mean, the uptake is about 18% before we instituted that, and it's sort of in the mid-20s afterwards. So there's still lots of reasons, other than the cost of the test, why people choose not to get tested, Dorothy. As you mentioned, there are many people in your family have chosen. So I think there's a combination of the change of medical care, and we have to sort of stop thinking about this. I'm not quite sure what I'm not sure what term to use, but it's this this idea that genetics is so exceptional and so weird and so unusual that you have to sort of think twice, think again, and think again when there's clearly an indication to get the testing done. And for Ashkenazi Jews, we know what the mutation rate is. When there's breast cancer in the family, especially when you're connected through men, it's something that I think most physicians today probably don't counsel properly.
I actually have a comment on the first comment that you had, is that when my dad shared the information for his brother to get tested, he went to his family practitioner, and his family practitioner said, you don't need to get tested, you're a man. And he insisted on it, not only because it affects men, but he also has 2 daughters as well, or 3 daughters as well, and a son. So, I just found it upsetting that that was what his doctor had told him, and trust doctors.
Cinnamon, I kind of wanted to ask you as a follow-up to that. Is there any research on why people don't get tested?
I think there's probably a large literature on that issue, and I don't know that I'm necessarily an expert in all of it, but I would say some people feel that they don't want to know. They would prefer to not go through their lives worrying about it. There have been studies looking at this with Alzheimer's and the ApoE4 variant, certainly looking at this in the area of kind of testing for Huntington's disease. There's been a lot of work as well. So I think there certainly is, there are important differences, as I was mentioning before, in terms of who decides to get tested, and then in terms of sort of the self-selection bias that kind of comes into play in this research.
Hello, Natasha Bonham. Thank you so much for such a great panel. This question's for Sarah and Dorothy. You both spoke a bit about going online a little bit and going online. I'll end it there. Could you speak a little bit about what you did or did not find when you were online looking for information and what maybe you expected. BRCA is, we've been talking about this for a long time. We would think that there would be a lot of resources, a lot out there, but it'd be great to hear a bit more about your experience, especially in that moment of what am I supposed to do next?
There are tons of resources out there about BRCA. That information was not hard to find. And it's all terrifying. Like, it's all terrifying when you've just gotten this news. It's funny, being on the other side of these surgeries, they don't seem quite as horrible, but being on that side of these surgeries, it felt like the worst thing that could happen. So all of that information is terrifying. What I didn't find, and the reason why I wrote about my experience, was this experience of people getting this surprise information from an at-home genetic test. That was the group of people that I was looking for that I couldn't find. So that was what I felt like needed to be out there more.
I did a lot of researching after my diagnosis. There is a lot of information out there, but you can really go down the rabbit hole. So I think when 2 a.m. on a Sunday, I was researching what a double mastectomy was like. Like, I went from 0 to 100 real fast. So it was really scary and a lot to take in, and no one really to guide me, step away. But also, it was hard to find women or men that had the gene that didn't have cancer yet. That was difficult for me to find a voice there. So. Yeah. Similar to Dorothy, I tried to write about that experience because it's different. And so there wasn't a lot there of what it feels like to have this percentage hanging over your head, but you don't have cancer yet. So there was a need for more voices there.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
Hi, Geoff Ginsberg from Duke. I also want to thank you guys for a terrific session. And particularly Sarah and Dorothy for sharing your stories and also be willing to share your data. Just to comment on that, I think we should imagine if all 26 million consumers actually agreed to share their data and create a virtual cohort. It would be 26 times the All of Us research program, perhaps, and it may be at a fraction of the cost. So I just think it's something that's worth thinking about, is the sort of the latent assets that the consumer industry have actually created that could actually catapult science and research further than anyone has gone before. You can comment on that, but I have a question more related to the family impact, which has come up several times. And I guess my question to Cinnamon is, how much has that been studied in the consumer testing world? Have you been able to assess any cascade effects, so to speak, of genetic testing into the families? And for Dorothy and Sarah, I guess I would ask you, you commented on this earlier, but I'd ask for some specific recommendations of what could be done to make it easier for you to have the conversations with your family and to actually have them embrace the information that you've received.
Sure. I would say, to me, throughout this experience, the genetic counselor was everything. If I didn't have that, I think I'd be very lost. And having someone walk me through and that emotional side of it, it's huge. And someone to just listen and be there for you. And that person can help walk you through, too, of how to talk to your family about it. So I think just the biggest aspect for me was having an actual person to walk me through, what does this look like when I have to tell my family? What is the impact of my family? How would I discuss this with my cousins? What's the best approach? And how do I even understand this information? So having an actual person, instead of, I can imagine there would be some issues if you just said, hey, take the 23andMe test too, and you'll figure it out and find it out. It's nice to have someone actually walk you through those steps.
I think for me, when I went and had my testing done in the hospital, my genetic counselor gave me sort of vouchers to give to my family to make it cheaper for them to get testing through through a company called Color. That was really helpful, but it's a mystery to me why my family refuses to get tested, and maybe that's an issue with my family. But I also feel like you can't make people do something. And I think this aspect of the Pandora's box that Sarah mentioned in her talk is huge. And my cousins have really sort of said to me, I don't want to know. I have a lot of issues with it. But, you know, it has to be an individual choice. It has to. And I don't know how much more besides knowledge and an incredibly low to free price. I don't know how much more you can do for people.
I'd also like to add that the age of someone, too, is really important. I don't know what it would have been like if I was 21 when I found this information out. I know that at 30, I was ready to hear it, but before, I think that would have been really, really overwhelming. So I like to also keep that in mind, too, of how old people are when they're getting this information.
So thanks for the question on the extent to which impacts on family have been studied. So I think in the studies that I'm aware of, predominantly the longitudinal cohort studies that I've mentioned, the question has been posed, you know, kind of who do you share this information with? It's how we got a lot of the information I presented on physician sharing. And those studies have also posed the question, you know, kind of very plainly, did you share with family members? And that percentage tends to be very high in those studies. I think in the Scripps study that I was involved with, it was something like 80% people saying, you know, just simply saying yes, right? I think there's been fewer studies that have looked, you know, very carefully at sort of how does that play out? What are sort of the downstream effects, any kind of cascade testing and so on and so forth. And I think, you know, that's an important area of study, particularly as we go into this kind of new era of DTC. I think previously, you know, from my perspective, a big focus in the studies was on sort of ensuring that there wasn't kind of inappropriate use of healthcare resources from engaging in testing. And so that may be one reason why it was looked at less frequently. I mean, the one study that I can sort of think of is the one I brought up previously that was done several years ago by Stanford faculty and individuals from 23andMe that looked at this, you know, invited people who were BRCA positive in their cohort to participate. You know, they got about, I think, 20% of mutation positive people in their database to participate. So it's just a snapshot of self-selected people. And I know that they did walk through sort of what the, you know, what were the downstream effects. And, you know, the report from that study suggested that there was a cascade effect whereby people shared with family and many family members sought additional testing and screening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle Penny, Biogen, and as co-chair of the roundtable with Geoff, I'd like to thank you guys for your panel today and actually all of the speakers for agreeing to come to this excellent workshop. So I was actually going to ask Mona's question, so I had to rethink my question as I was standing in line. But I want to pull on that thread about understanding your the use of your sample for research. And I think it will be, to Cinnamon's point, really interesting to see some new research on people's perception of what their samples are used for, particularly given in your slide in 2018 you noted that, you know, GSK had made a substantial investment in 23andMe. And so I just wondered about your perception of who uses your sample, and is there a trust thing there, that there's a difference between a physician, because I think, Dorothy, you said doctors using my sample for research, or for a pharmaceutical company like Biogen using your sample for research?
I don't feel like there's a difference. You know, anybody who's gonna do it, use it for good, is okay. I think the concern more comes in with some of the concerns that I think Cinnamon had in her slide, which is insurance companies using it to deny insurance. I mean, that was terrifying to me, especially because I had a mutation. I was hopeful that because I took care of it so quickly, that my insurance company would then say, oh, how responsible of you, we'll lower your premiums. But the thought of insurers, employers, advertisers, the police, like there's a whole world of terrifying uses of the DNA. But I would personally consider drug companies in the same vein as researchers. They're going to use it to make better drugs. So that's my hope.
Thank you. I'm sure they will.
I'm along the same lines of Dorothy. I'm happy as long as it's shared in a good use, and I'm kind of a positive thinker, so in my mind, it would be. And yeah, I think there is, for me, I guess, a trust with 23andMe that they would utilize this information wisely and be able to make, draw really helpful research from it and help other consumers down the road. There's not much concern for me about pharmaceutical companies utilizing it. I'm hoping that that would be a good thing, and they could hopefully find help for people that carry the BRCA1 and 2 mutation.
If I could just add to that, I think it is a really important question to consider. One thing it reminds me of is a few years ago when 23andMe announced its intention to engage in some seeking patents, and I know there was expressions of concern online among many customers. I don't know the extent to which that was sort of studied systematically, but certainly I think those uses are worth thinking about.
How are you? Jordan Laser from Northwell Health and the Association for Molecular Pathology. First off, the 3 wonderful presentations, and really thank you for sharing your insights. I think one of the roots here is that information really is a double-edged sword. I think on one side, you guys were really empowered to make some really positive, life-changing decisions. Yet on the other side, you really had some really a harrowing emotional experience as well. So, and I don't think it's really unique to consumer genetics either. I can say from my personal experience, being somewhat responsible for a patient portal in our health system, patients, I hear unfortunate stories, the Sunday 2 a.m. of a patient finding that they have cancer in the middle of the night, and they're alone. So, I think while we have this forum and some of the key players in this space, what advice would you have for the diagnostic community, the consumer genetic community, to provide that support? And what things could we do to help minimize that emotional situation 24/7?
I think if I could do anything differently, it would have been someone on the phone telling me it. I'm a genetic counselor. They would have set me up with someone right away. I did a lot of research on my own, trying to find the best genetic counselor and make an appointment right away. And there was that gap between Monday to Friday that I was just sitting with these results and researching to no end. So if I could change one thing, it would be having that genetic counselor right away there for you and already set up, because I think that would have been tremendously helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that 100%. When I've had conversations with people about, well, if you're going to get bad news, isn't there some way to give it to you over the phone? And there should be. I mean, it's serious health stuff. I mean, the other point I wanted to make about your question about knowledge is that one of the things that I also feel, and I don't know if you felt this, is that our knowledge of all of this stuff is so early. So I wouldn't be surprised if 10 years from now they find out that, oh, I also have genes that would have worked to protect me from getting breast cancer, or that that the interactions are much more complicated than we view them right now. But I wasn't willing to wait around for that, and that's frustrating too. That I have a small amount of knowledge, and it led me to these giant health decisions. but I know that I don't have all of the knowledge. So I guess I'd say those two things. But the most important thing is, just to echo what Sarah said, just a person to talk to.
I think also too, when you get the results, it's not defined for you. Like I said, when I went to the genetic counselor and I'm 30 years old, it's much different of my statistics. So if that was in the report too, at being at this age, this is what you might see versus that 85% I was just seeing and staring at the screen. So I think if it could be even more personalized too, that could help.
Great, thank you for the comments, and I think we could, I'm sure there are many of us here who empathize with the Dr. Google rabbit hole. So.
Hi, Nikki Sideropoulos from the University of Vermont Medical Center and a member of the Roundtable. Thank you. So Sarah, you said, and I thought it was really well put, and Dorothy, you certainly echoed this, I got my power back, right? You were able to take a scary mutation that's well-defined and have an action plan, and probably didn't run into too many insurance issues around carrying out that action plan. So I'll give you a what if, right? I mean, what if you were given news of something that didn't have a well-defined action plan? What if you couldn't get your power back in the way that you did? How does that change thinking about doing this type of testing again? So I'm just kind of curious what you think about that scenario.
I think about that a lot. What would it be, you know, what would it be like if there was a gene that I couldn't do anything about? I don't know if I would have the same stance. Maybe if I could feel like I had some sort of power, like I could have a better diet, exercise, or do something, I might want to know. But if it was my ultimate fate, and like there's nothing that I could do, that would, I can only imagine the anxiety I felt before my double mastectomy. If I had to live with that anxiety,
right,
that would be tremendously hard.
Yeah, I mean, I feel similarly, but one thing that I've learned through this whole experience is that the way you anticipate you're going to feel in a situation and the way you feel when that situation comes up tend to be two different things. So in my head, I feel like that would be unbearable. Like that would be the worst torture I could imagine. But then I also think, well, I never thought I could get through a double mastectomy, and here I am. So as human beings, I think we come up with coping mechanisms and we deal. But it's a scary thought. It's a very, very scary thought.
Thank you.
I think we have time for another question, and then I would like the panelists to kind of share some final thoughts.
Wonderful session. Really enjoyed it. And as much as the session, I think, and the talks were great, so is the dialogue. So thanks for everyone participating. You know, the interesting thing is that it's not very hard to gate a specific result out of the laboratory before it would go to a consumer. I think there are some really tough choices that groups need to make in order to bring you rapid, cost-effective testing that way. And Dr. Nussbaum was talking in his opening comments about the differences between clinical testing, direct-to-consumer testing, and then kind of this hybrid of near-consumer testing where the ordering is still driven by the consumer, but there is a physician involved. And in that paradigm, there's an opportunity up front to make sure that the testing that's being ordered is appropriate. But on the back end, if a specific result is seen, it gets flagged and it goes into a holding pattern until you are reached by a genetic counselor or by a physician, which again, if you get that phone call, you're gonna have that anxiety. But I'd be curious to know, what are your thoughts about that model versus the email, you have this mutation, here are some additional resources for you to look up, versus you get the phone call from 23andMe, for example. I'm not sure if they're one that actually offers that service, but let's just keep it as the same for argument's sake. You get that phone call and, hey, there's a genetic counselor from 23andMe. You know immediately that they're not here to tell you good news. Would that be better than the experience you had? And would you prefer that?
Yes.
Yeah, I would say, yeah. Both would be hard, no matter what. However you hear it, it's going to be pretty traumatizing. But again, because my mind can go 1,000 different places in 1 second, just having someone walk me through what it means. I could barely even read what I was trying, like I was trying to read everything, and it was really hard to absorb. So yes, if I had two choices, I would choose the person calling me and being able to walk me through what it actually means for myself and where I am in my life, and just to have someone listen to what it's like, you know, what am I feeling right now, and kind of that emotion and the feelings of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's no perfect way to give this kind of information. It's bad information. So the only world where you give it and there's no anxiety is if you are giving a different piece of information. So, you know, within that realm, yes, having somebody call you on the phone and be able to immediately put it in perspective for you would make all the difference. It would make a huge difference.
Thank you so much. One final comment, and I'm sure all my colleagues are going to punch me in the gut when we get out into the hallway for saying this, but getting FDA approval is not easy. And so I give a lot of credit to companies like 23andMe that actually roll up their sleeves and do the hard work to get FDA approval. That said, it really is hard from the FDA's perspective, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, but do have and have read kind of the journey to getting FDA approval for consumer tests. Comprehension is a really big deal, right? And so there are levels of comprehension that need to be achieved in order for a test to be safe and efficacious in the direct-to-consumer market. But it seems like there's a psychosocial piece that is missed between, yes, I know I have that mutation, and oh my gosh, what does this mean for my life now? So I'm not advocating that the FDA put another step in there, but it does seem like there is that psychosocial piece that isn't part of the logic that, you know, this test is ready for direct consumer use. Thank you.
On that note, perhaps the three of you could address a little bit about how you think consumers should view these tests. Like, would you actually recommend that people do these tests knowing that it's a possibility that they could get this bad news, although most people probably won't get that news?
I mean, I recommend to people that, sure, it's a good idea, but go into it with your eyes open. You could get terrible news, but you could also not get terrible news, but still have something terrible going on in your DNA. And I just think, I just do really want to say that it means a lot that you guys asked us to come and speak here, like a lot, because I feel like often the consumer experience is missed out in this, and it's not something that people are thinking about or taking seriously. So I think we appreciate it, and it's important.
Yeah, I would like to echo Dorothy's sentiments. It means so much to be here to share my story and hopefully to make an impact going forward. But I say each person is different. It depends. Like I said, it's opening up Pandora's box, and make sure you want to know that. Imagine if you do get bad news, are you able to handle that? And I think also, how will this, you have to think about how will it affect your family? How will it affect the important people in your life? And are you ready to make decisions if you have that information, but also knowing the limitations too of, especially the 23andMe BRCA report only has 3 mutations. So knowing those limitations, I think, is a really important thing to communicate as well.
All right, well, I think our time is up, and we'll take a break now, and thank you all for your very great questions, and thank you again to our speakers for sharing.